Chapter 16, Part 1, Minimizing International Risks. This is certainly a timely chapter given recent events on the world stage. And in fact, the peso depreciating right now reminds me of some events in my past. Specifically, the peso is depreciating in light of Donald Trump's ascension to the presidency, largely because of his threats to build a wall and isolate America from Mexico and Mexico from America. The peso has lost value because few people want to hold it, assuming that recent events will negatively impact the economy of Mexico. Now, depreciation is a naturally occurring event. Currency is a commodity, like others, that depends on supply and demand. If a lot of people want to hold a currency, that currency will appreciate or go up in value. Conversely, if for some reason people lose faith in that currency or that economy, it will depreciate or go down in value. As I said, I had a similar situation in 1994. However, that was a devaluation rather than a depreciation. At that time, I was freshly out of school and happily exporting construction equipment to various places, especially Mexico. And the Mexican government wanted to increase Mexico's exports. So to make their goods cheaper, they devalued the currency. So although it wasn't the same as a depreciation because it was government imposed rather than a more naturally occurring economic event, the end result was largely the same. Not only did it make Mexican goods cheaper, but it made American goods going to Mexico relatively more expensive. So I lost my market literally overnight and got to do something else. But here I am. It all worked out. So that little vignette is a very good example of one of the risks that we'll spend some time on, namely foreign exchange risk. And I'd like to talk about various types of risks, specifically commercial, political, and foreign exchange risk. Commercial risk is the risk that a company takes by offering some form of credit. It's obviously easier to check on the creditworthiness of a buyer in the United States. It's also easier to follow up on debts within this country. It's a little harder when they're overseas. Political risk is another really interesting area in that Dominic Rossi, the global CIO of equities of Fidelity International, recently commented, quote, "We are heading into a world of unprecedented political risk," which calls into question the pillars of the post-World War II settlement. It's unsurprising investors are heading for cover, end quote. Interestingly enough, he was also thinking about largely events in the United States and how that might impact the rest of the world. As your author points out, quote, "Examples of political risk include the risk of war, kidnapping, or significant economic shocks that could affect exporters, such as delay of payments," end quote. Thus, this does fit the model. Your author goes on to include the risk of expropriation in political risk, and this is something that we think of more commonly as an obvious political risk. A couple of chapters ago, we talked about airlines pulling out of Venezuela due to political risk. It's interesting to note that things in Venezuela have actually seemingly gotten worse in terms of popular unrest. And against that background of crisis, the U.S. Supreme Court is hearing arguments involved in a case of expropriation that took place in 2010, when the late Hugo Chávez's government decided to take over an American business. It was Oklahoma-based, an international drilling company that had 11 of its oil exploration towers seized. And a foreign exchange risk is the risk that extends from the date of the contract to date of payment, in that currency exchange rates are continually changing. And if they change during that time period in a non-favorable manner, it may be problematic for the exporter, as we saw with my example of Mexico. Your author points out that pricing in dollars doesn't necessarily help if the foreign buyer, as in my example, cannot afford to get those dollars to buy your product. There are three types of foreign exchange risk: Transaction risk is associated with a time delay between entering into a contract and the time that it's settled. Obviously, the greater amount of time, the greater amount of risk, because there's more time for the currencies, two currencies to fluctuate. Economic risk deals with macroeconomic conditions and the potential for an international company to become non-competitive due to changes in the exchange rate between its base of operations and that of its customers. And then last, translation risk deals with the gains or losses from restating financial statements into dollars. A good example of that, coming back to Venezuela, is Colgate-Palmolive, which was hit with losses from their significant holdings in Venezuela, so much so that they have recently decided they will no longer include the results of its operations there on its balance sheet. Let's look at some ways to minimize risk. First, let's look at minimizing commercial risk. It's very common practice to use a letter of credit, or if you can, get cash in advance, and we'll explore letters of credit in the next video. In terms of minimizing commercial risk, if a letter of credit is not acceptable, or cash in advance, it's important to determine the company's credit background. And one way to do this, that's also common with looking at U.S. companies, is to look at Dun & Bradstreet. So if we look at Dun & Bradstreet, you'll notice that you can look for the United States, obviously, but you can also look in other countries. So let's say that we're looking for, a company in France. There you go. So you can see you can get quite a bit of information. You can go search. We won't actually look at specific companies since we don't have a lot of time on this video, but let's move forward. A couple of additional thoughts on commercial risk is to think about foreign receivables insurance. One company that's very well known in the field is Coface. And the insurance, the foreign receivables insurance, basically compensates you if the buyer doesn't pay. Yet another resource is Exim Bank. Export-Import Bank is a government-owned entity that enables U.S. exporters to both finance their export activities and to mitigate the risk of non-payment. The interesting thing is that President-elect Donald Trump has spoken very unfavorably about Exim Bank and may soon target it for extinction. All right, moving onward. Let's look at minimizing political risk. Similar to the commercial risk that we just talked about, one of the first things to look at is understanding what level of political risk you face in a given country. And for that, there are a couple of really good resources. One is Global Edge. And since we talked about Venezuela before, let's take a look at Venezuela to see how they are ranked by Global Edge in terms of political risk. So let's see if we can pull that up. And you can see there's quite a bit of information. So we'll go straight to risk. And we can see that, not surprisingly, they're rated as a really, really problematic risk. Another resource for assessing political risk is Euler Hermes. And they've also got a map kind of similar to the one we just looked at. So we can kind of take a look and see what Venezuela looks like according to them. So if we click on the map, we can see that they agree, not surprisingly, that the country risk level is very, very high. So this company is interesting in that you can drill down further than we are right now. We're just kind of scratching the surface. In that you can look at their country reports. They also have weekly reports that are just fascinating to see how risk is moving in various parts of the world. Okay, coming back to political risk and mitigating political risk, one other resource to be aware of is OPIC, which is also a government entity that offers political risk insurance. So let's move on and look at financial risk. So financial risk takes various forms, as we said before. And along the same lines, there are different ways that you can mitigate foreign exchange risk. One is by netting, where you're basically offsetting. If you have a large enough entity, you're offsetting transactions, you're offsetting the purchase of a currency by one subsidiary with the sale of that currency by another subsidiary. So it's kind of an intra-company hedge in its own network against currency fluctuations. Okay, another option is a forward contract, which is a customized contract between two parties to buy or sell a particular currency at a specified future price on a future date. So a forward contract can occur, the settlement can occur on a cash or delivery basis, and they don't trade on a centralized exchange. And in that way, they differ from a futures contract. A futures contract, which is a bit more expensive, is a legal agreement to buy or sell a currency at a predetermined price at a specific date in the future that is exchange traded. And then lastly, an options contract is a tradable forward contract with the option to either buy or not buy the currency at the agreed price. I'd invite you to look at the table in your chapter on comparing hedging tools, but I just kind of want to point out that futures and options generally are limited to larger companies because they tend to be more expensive approaches. And then lastly, I would invite you to take a look at the video on the Big Mac Index, which is just fascinating. And I think you'll enjoy discussing that in the discussion forum. I look forward to your comments.